Good afternoon, and thank you very much, Yvonne, and thank you to the NCSC for inviting me. It's a great pleasure to be here and talk to you about our experience and our work with Portugal. So many of you might know Portugal. It's a very usually sunny country of about 10 million people, and we worked with them very closely a few years ago, and we are still in touch with some of the colleagues. And there are many interesting lessons to be learned from their approach and also their policy reform to make their system more inclusive. So I'll be talking about both the strengths, but also the challenges and what we can learn from Portugal. So to tell you a little bit about the work, so we reviewed our inclusive education system. And we were a review team composed of myself, my colleague Alexandra from OECD, and then we had two external experts. You might recognize some of their names. Professor May Enskov, who is affiliated with the universities of Manchester and Glasgow, and Professor Malakwa, who is the Abo Academy in Finland. We work with the Department of Education in Portugal, and they prepared a background report based on the guidelines and questions we asked, in a way to self-evaluate themselves. And we also did review visits. This was during COVID, so many of them were virtual. We had a lot of virtual interviews with stakeholders, with about 200 policymaking stakeholders, and we were fortunate enough to be able to visit 6 schools then in person, where they were around the country, and there was great variation in the type of schools that we visited. And then we presented the final report in Portugal in March 2022. It was co-funded by the European Commission, and I'll also tell you a little bit about what Portugal has done since we published this report. So as Yvonne mentioned, I lead the Education for Inclusive Societies team. This is a topic that is, of course, of great importance as we see in the world of the many changes happening, and we focus particularly on how to support governments and stakeholders making the education systems more equitable and more inclusive, and in a way as a pillar then to more inclusive societies later on. We've developed a policy framework where we look at 6 dimensions of diversity. They range from migration to ethnic groups to gender identity, sexual orientation, special education needs, and giftedness. And we also look at how they intersect. So many countries have group students, but of course, as Lani also mentioned this morning, everybody is very individual with very complex identities, and those require also some more perhaps unique approaches and support to these students. And we work in 5 key policy areas, and they guide our work. They also guided the report and the review that we did. So we go from governing diversity, equity, inclusion. So this has to do with all the regulatory frameworks, with responsibilities for education provision, also the engagement with stakeholders, the curriculum. Then, this moves quickly. Then we look at resourcing, so what kind of resources are provided, both by mainstream and targeted. Look at developing capacity. This has to do with all the preparation and evaluation of teachers, school leaders, non-teaching staff, also awareness raising. Then we look at promoting school-level interventions. So what happens actually in the schools? How are these regulatory frameworks implemented? And then also we look at monitoring and evaluating outcomes and the policies. All these 5 go very much hand in hand. So my presentation, or the next part of the presentation, is structured around these 5 policy areas, but in the end we combined some of them into a specific chapter. So I'll tell you a little bit more about it. So what are the strengths? So Portugal, actually nearly all school-age children are enrolled in compulsory education up to the age of 18 years old. They have had significant improvements in overall student performance in all subjects, reading, mathematics, and science over decades. They have also above OECD average well-being outcomes in terms of sense of belonging, making friends, etc. And the rate of early leavers from education is reduced significantly in Portugal, but there is still great variation in between the regions. So in the center, it's about 8%, but in regions such as Algarve, it's about 20%. So there's still some challenges. Other challenges are that there are important differences in student learning well-being outcomes for students, particularly those from disadvantaged, diverse backgrounds, low-income families, immigrant backgrounds, and also Roma communities, so still work to be done. Tell you a little bit about inclusive education in Portugal. It has actually a long history of promoting first the integration of students with special education needs into mainstream schools. This already started in the 1970s, and there was a lot of work happening in the 1990s, also due to the 1994 Salamanca Declaration. So this has, the change in 2018 was actually, there's a long preparation for that. In the decree of 2008 already defined the specialized support for the inclusion of students with special education needs in mainstream schools. At that time, there were about 93 special schools. And then there is this very new and innovative decree law 2018, number 54, on inclusive education. Also to reiterate what we heard already this morning, in Portugal, inclusive education, this is for all learners. So it does not distinguish anymore by groups. It's not only for students with special education needs, but it's for all students. And at that time, there were, since 2018, there's been only about 10 special schools for very complex cases. They have also had an effort to abandon labeling. So students are not labeled anymore by their characteristics, and it's moved to a different type of new categories that are based on the type of measures that students receive, and I will go into that very soon. And the diversity and inclusion, they're made legal and policy documents education programs. So it's not only an inclusion law, but there is also a curriculum autonomy law. There is also different citizenship programs. There is also the curriculum basically goes through all their policy documents, so it's very streamlined and very comprehensive. So we identified 3 priority areas in inclusive education, and this is the chapters in the report dealt with each of these. One was the strengthening governance and financing of inclusive education. The second one was developing capacity for diversity, equity, inclusion education, and the third one was promoting school-level responses to student diversity. So I will go through each of them in a little bit more detail. And for each, we looked at strengths, challenges, and then policy recommendations. So the strengths, it's a very comprehensive system on inclusive education, and it's widely known among stakeholders. Everyone we talked to was aware of it, supported it, and this was a very good start. The government also conducted a very broad consultation process and also regularly consults different education stakeholders. So everybody was aware of it, they were buying into it. They were able to ask questions, raise concerns, etc. And this very much helped not only for passing the law, but also for then the support that the education system needed and the students needed after the law came into effect. There is also a new curriculum framework which reflects broad citizenship and inclusive values and enables schools to adapt to their local context. I will be telling you a little bit more about this. And then there are many programs, structures, and human resources available to support equity and inclusion. Nonetheless, there are some challenges. One of them is that there is, when we reviewed it, there's a lack of clarity and coherence regarding responsibilities for administration of inclusion between different levels of governance. So when you have a new policy change, it takes a while, and this was, I think, one of the challenges that the colleagues also identified. It actually takes a long time to change the mentality of people and also get them used to these new approaches. So it was not always clear of who was responsible for the student support, what levels, and how to really implement this. The education system was also, because for a long time was very focused on students' special education needs, it continued to focus a lot on the inclusion of students with special education needs, but there were many other students who also needed support, whether they were from Roma backgrounds, immigrant backgrounds, from very disadvantaged backgrounds, a combination of all of these or any other characteristics. So this also takes quite a lot of time to change. And there were also some challenges around the management of available resources to support inclusion, particularly around human resources and municipalities. Portugal has been undergoing a decentralization process where municipalities receive much more autonomy and it differed a lot based on the municipality that the schools were located in, what support they provided, whether the municipalities, what resources they had, for instance, to hire non-teaching staff, etc. So there was also quite a lot of variation. So some of the recommendations were, for this particular priority area, was improving the governance of inclusive education through better synergies and accountability mechanism between the different levels. So making sure that there is accountability in place, but there were also more synergies because the system works in various levels, both actually vertically and horizontally. And it is important to have the support, not only the schools, municipalities, but also at the regional level. And then, of course, a lot of support came also from the central level, particularly from the Ministry of Education. Another recommendation was to sustain the collaboration and consultation strategies to broaden the understanding of inclusive education. So we heard already this morning a lot about the importance of collaboration. And that is very important. You need all the different education partners, stakeholders to collaborate, and particularly collaborations in the schools and the clusters that Portugal has are very important, and collaborations also with the researchers. Another recommendations was to improve the management of resources and also continue efforts to build a coherent funding system. So when you have a big policy change, it is also key that your funding mechanisms are very much aligned with the objectives that you have, and that the principles of equity and inclusion are throughout the whole funding system. And then the fourth one was strengthen the management of system-level monitoring and evaluation of inclusive education. So in the review, we did look at monitoring and evaluation, but Portugal, around more or less the similar time, was working with the European Agency for Special Needs and Inclusive Education on developing a monitoring framework for schools and developing indicators on how the schools could monitor whether they were inclusive or not. Another important aspect to mention is that the law of inclusive education actually says that every 3 years the country needs to evaluate the results that they have and the impact that the law has had, and if necessary make some changes. So there is a kind of a constant evaluation monitoring mechanisms already in place, but that needed to also be first built up. The second priority areas was developing capacity, and we've heard quite a lot about it this morning. This is a very important policy area. So some of the strengths is that Portugal has implemented progressive measures aimed at addressing diversity and providing support for teachers and broader school personnel to develop and improve the professional practice. There's been a lot of effort put into providing support for the teachers who in a way needed to be retrained and supported, that they are able to support children in mainstream classrooms with the needs that they might have. The teachers in Portugal are also highly qualified and value inclusive education, so many of them that we spoke to saw the value of it and were very keen to be supportive and help as much as needed. And there is quite a lot of structures and offers for continuing professional learning. Nonetheless, there have been also some challenges. One of them was that there's been inadequate initial teacher preparation and continuing professional learning for diversity, equity, and inclusion. Many of the initial teacher preparation courses were not mandatory. They were often as elective. They were not the whole initial teacher preparation program was changed to correspond and to align with this new inclusion law. Some of the challenges are that the universities and the teacher colleges are independent, so the Ministry of Education can provide guidance and work with them, but they can basically decide what program they want to implement, and that takes quite a lot of time to change that and ensure that they're not just elective courses, but that the focus on diversity, equity, inclusion is throughout the whole initial teacher preparation program. The continuing professional learning is also very important. Actually, at the time, there were some courses on supporting students' special education needs, but because the approach has changed, the teachers did not really feel well prepared to support students, for instance, from multilingual, multicultural backgrounds or Roma backgrounds, so didn't have enough preparation for that. Another challenge in Portugal is a centralized teacher recruitment allocation system. So except for private schools, the public schools, they cannot select their teachers and the school personnel that is assigned to them. And because the contracts, many of the younger teachers are on temporary contracts. One year they might be in one school, next year they're in a different school. So it is actually also quite difficult to build and support the teachers, and that they also get to know the families and the students and the school culture when they are moving around a lot. Another challenge was that the teacher evaluation strategies, it was not always transparent how the teachers were scored and how the scoring was used. So that also led to a lot of insecurity and a lot of stress for the teachers. And as I already mentioned, there was also quite a narrow view of diversity. A lot was still focused on students with special education needs. Some of it had to do because there's, in that time when the law was passed, there were about 7,800 special education needs teachers. And many of them were recruited, were retrained to be able to support students with all the different needs. So the system was very much, had these specialized, very specialized teachers who then had to be able to support actually all students and parents, etc. So some of the recommendations was identify and build on good practices that were identified and that we saw many of them in the schools to promote collaboration and capacity building. And this is very important, not only to have collaboration within the schools, so with school leaders, with the teachers, with the non-teaching staff, with the counselors, but also have collaborations across schools and have collaborations with researchers. And there are some good practices already in the system, but that time was not systematic, and a lot of it depended on the individual efforts by the teachers, by the school leaders, and often by the clusters as well. Another recommendation was to expand continuing professional learning opportunities for teachers to support diversity and inclusion. And I'll tell you what Portugal has done since then to particularly focus on this area, what kind of courses they have implemented. A third recommendation was to implement multicultural teacher education to mainstream diversity, equity, inclusion courses. This was mostly to be able to support the teachers who did not have much training to now, managing and supporting students who came from very different backgrounds, so that they could receive the best support possible. Another recommendation was improving the recruitment, retention, and attractiveness of the teaching profession to strengthen inclusive education. So some of it had to do with how the teachers can be recruited and how they can be also retained. It's very difficult to build an inclusive system when you don't know from year to year which teacher will be in your school, and also how you can, you have to invest in the training, and the teachers need to get to know the school and the families and the students. And so some of it is also ensuring that teaching profession, this is a big challenge in many countries, remains attractive to really have the best teachers possible. And another recommendation was also promoting a recruitment of teachers from diverse ethnic, cultural, linguistic backgrounds. Again, this is a challenge in many countries. The student population is very diverse, but the teacher population is much less diverse. So there's been also some efforts to ensure that the teachers are supported and are able to get into the teaching profession, but also remain in teaching profession from very different backgrounds. The third priority area is promoting school-level responses to diversity. So there is, as we heard already also this morning a lot, there is quite a lot of variation on how the different policies and laws, how they are implemented in schools. It matters a lot what the school leader does, how the school culture is built, what school climate exists, how the school works with the families, with the students. So in Portugal, there's been widespread commitment, and this is not only in the schools, this is in the society, in the communities of these principles, diversity, equity, inclusion. And this is a very big strength. You need that to be able to move forward. There's been also significant human resources can be mobilized to support developments. I already mentioned there were about 7,800 special education needs teachers who then could be mobilized and retrained and are able now to support all students. And Portugal has a well-established school cluster system, and this really is a big advantage to support more inclusive arrangements. So Portugal, many years ago, they've reconfigured a little bit how they organize their school system, and they have number of school clusters, and they range in the number of schools that they have. They usually go from early child education up to upper secondary education. And they can vary in size depending on the student population. There can be between 2 and 28 school clusters, but most school clusters have about 4 to 7 schools. And there is one leadership team for this school cluster. And this is very helpful because then you can have actually a dedicated team, not only the school leadership, but also you have different multidisciplinary teams composed of, for example, psychologists and therapists, etc., who are able to support the school cluster or permanent support. Nonetheless, there are unequal challenges, particularly this unequal implementation of the framework. So it differed a lot based on the schools, but also based on the municipality, and this created a lot of variation for the support that students received. The use of resources in schools can also encourage separate arrangements. We heard about it already this morning from Lani, that even though almost all students are in mainstream classes and in mainstream schools, there is still quite a bit of individual or small group tutoring, and where the students are taking out of the classroom, and that can encourage separate arrangements. But there's been some efforts since then to diminish that. Then there is sometimes limited professional learning opportunities for teachers and school leaders. Often it depended a lot on the initiatives of teachers and school leaders to basically organize themselves and learn from other schools and other teachers and school leaders. There is often also lack of local area coordination. So in a way, you do need the support at the local level, and the exchanges also at the local level. And there were also kind of limited strategies for manipulation of policies and practices. But again, Portugal has since then been moving forward to respond to that. So some of the recommendations were introducing a program for professional learning that is focused on promotion of inclusive classroom practices, and that is variety of different practices ranging from textbooks, but also the pedagogies that are used in the classroom, etc. Another recommendation was formulating clear guidance on the use of support resources with schools and communities. So to be able to provide this guidance on how do you use this support resources that are actually available, but many schools, communities did not know how to use them. Another recommendation was ensuring there's a coordinated structure of local support to schools and clusters in promoting equity and inclusion. So you do also need this coordination part because otherwise there is a lot of everybody's kind of on their own and might not also know what resources are even available. And then strengthening the strategies for monitoring and evaluating inclusive education practices at local and school level. So again, the monitoring and evaluation are very important, and Portugal recognizes and are also working on that area of how you monitor not only at the school level, but also at the system level and the local level. So I'd like to tell you a little bit about the next steps for Portugal. They have, of course, since then moved forward a bit. This is actually a slide from the Portuguese colleagues on their action plan. So based on our recommendations, they developed an action plan which had a variety of different steps. One was the production of resources for training different educational actors, leaders, teachers, technicians. This is what they call the non-teaching staff. This is very much an ongoing process. They've also focused a lot on the training of the trainers and the support and monitoring teams and local disseminating agents, so focusing both at the system but also the local levels. They also put in place a national program for training teachers and non-teaching staff. And they've also moved forward on the monitoring proximity support to schools and communities, and also commissioned more research in the field of inclusive educational practices. And they focus a lot on the dissemination communication. Sometimes they had resources in place, but the schools and the school leaders and the teachers and the parents were often not aware of it. So some of the short-term policy measures that they took is focused a lot on formulating clear guidance on the use of support resources within schools and communities. So as I mentioned, there's still this shift from moving from these traditional perspectives on supporting students' special education needs towards this multi-level approach. Another one was strengthening capacities and work of local multidisciplinary teams. I'll explain in a second. Encouraging collaborative problem solving, again, something that I think resonates after this morning. And then drawing also on the support of other actors. There are a lot of other actors that are very keen to be involved, very supportive, and it's important to draw on them, including the families, the communities, the researchers. Another short-term policy measure was to strengthen the strategies for monitoring and evaluation. And they focus a lot on encouraging the self-evaluation with the use of monitoring system, as I mentioned, that they've developed with the European Agency for Special Needs and Inclusive Education. Also focus a lot on the data collection analysis, deepen the school's knowledge of the inspection framework. The inspection framework also has a big component now on equity and inclusion. And they've also helped or focused a lot on encouraging municipality staff to play a key role in coordinating local support, local monitoring strategies, and improving accountability, also a very key one. So what are some of the key lessons? There are many, but since I don't have that much time, I would like to focus just on a few. The first one is the regulatory framework. As I already mentioned, this is really the key aspect of their whole reform, and this gives the students the right to receive the support that they need. Again, all students have access to mainstream education, and regardless of the education training modalities courses that they attend. It defines the set of support measures that must be adapted to the social context, the characteristics of children, families. It abandons this categorization labeling system, and it establishes a continuous support of provision according to the universal design learning and the multi-level approach to access to curriculum. And again, it also defines the mobilization of resources as a complement in different areas. So of course, it's not only up to just the education area, but you also need to draw on areas of health, employment, vocational training, and social security. So in that case, it's not only the Ministry of Education, but they work very closely with other ministries as well in policy areas. Leadership and consultation, very important aspect as well. So Portugal benefited from a very strong political leadership by João Costa, who was the time Secretary of State for Education, then he became the Minister of Education, and he surrounded himself with also a very committed and strong team of colleagues at the Ministry of Education. Many of them were actually teachers who were commissioned for a number of years to help and support putting this in place. And you need people who are convinced of what you're doing is right and are willing to go the extra mile to also conduct these consultations, meet with many different stakeholders. It's not only the teachers, the school leaders, but it's also the parents, very important stakeholders as well. Both the parents of the students, for instance, who have special education needs, but also the parents from students who perhaps don't have any specific needs, to explain to them why this step is important and how is this going to benefit all children. It was actually a very quick process. It was about 1 year between the draft proposal and the law, which is very, very short. But as I mentioned before, in a way, they have been preparing this for many decades. So there was already structures in place and the discussion was in place, but this was a very, very short time, and many didn't think it was going to happen, and many, of course, did not feel prepared. So a lot of the work was also happening once the law was passed and supporting particularly the schools and the teachers and the students and the communities. There was also very strong leadership by the school leaders. The school leaders are key actors. In a way, they bring everybody on board. They work very closely with the teachers, with the parents, with the students. They set the school climate. And we've met many very committed school leaders who really believe in this and who spend a lot of their free time and a lot of their work in really being very, very committed and providing really a lot of support. As I mentioned, there was a lot of consultation. This was followed also passed on a rigorous evaluation process on what they have been already doing. There was a working group established composed of different state secretaries, representative of different organizations from different organizations, but also groups. And they engaged with many different stakeholders. And there was also public consultations, both in writing and also open talks. You know, in Ireland, you also have a big consultation culture. And this was very important to bring as many people as possible on board and gain this buy-in. It's very important for any law that is, or any policy reform that is passed, that you have as many people as possible on board, because of course there will be challenges, but if you have people who believe in what you are doing, it makes it in a way easier. It's not easy, but at least you have this commitment. Teacher professional learning, we heard already quite a lot about the importance of that this morning. And Portugal, based on their own recommendations, they actually spent a lot of time and effort in providing resources for teachers continuing professional learning through ebooks. So these are the 5 different topics that they prepared ebooks for. And there's some variety of areas: management of inclusive education, diversity, equity, inclusion, universal design for learning, inclusion in the classroom, and inclusive learning environments. They also have a website with a lot of resources that the teachers can go to. So a lot of effort also on the continuing professional learning, which is help to prepare the teachers, focusing on the management of inclusive education and promoting inclusive classroom practices. So how do you develop inclusive practices in terms of cooperative learning, differentiate pedagogies? How do you strengthen collaboration between teachers, clusters, school staff, students? How do you also strengthen the student participating in school decisions? I know this in Ireland is also very important to engage with the students, give them a voice. Portugal has also spent a lot of effort on it. When we visited schools, we have also spoken to students in the schools. How do you develop also language of practice, and how do you engage with evidence? So collaboration with universities and sharing experiences are also key. And they've put together a program for continuing professional learning, different courses, some on leadership and promoting inclusive educational environments, some on inclusive pedagogical practices, and one course on creating inclusive and innovative learning environments. And these were for school leaders, but also teachers of preschool, primary, and secondary education. Another important lesson is on curriculum and assessment. So in a way, in parallel to the law on inclusive education, they also passed a law in 2018 on autonomy and curriculum flexibility. So schools are provided with up to 25% of curriculum autonomy to meet their specific needs. So they can foster pedagogical differentiation in the classroom. They can also foster interdisciplinary work and project-based methodologies. They can create new subjects, and they can also allow upper secondary students to choose their own course format and to be able to swap and replace subjects. In a way, there was already, prior to 2018, after 2018, they passed an ordinance 2019 that also allowed public and private schools to manage more than 25% of curriculum by designing innovation plans. So the schools can actually apply to have greater flexibility, but they have to put together this innovation plan and submit it to the Ministry of Education, who then assess it. So in a way, there's quite, well, to some extent there is this flexibility in order to be able to support the students in the classroom, also in the curriculum. And the pedagogical model is built around the notion that all students have learning potential that can be harnessed when students receive adequate support. They focus a lot on the universal design for learning model, but also the multi-level approach to access the curriculum. Of course, even if you have curriculum flexibility, there is still a lot of challenges around assessment. So Portugal has both low-stakes assessment at certain grades, but also high-stakes assessment, but those apply to actually all learners. So there is still a way to go on what you do about the assessment when you have this curriculum flexibility. How do you also adapt and make the assessment more inclusive. So I'm sure many of you are familiar with Universal Design for Learning. This has also been adopted in quite a few countries by now. It is actually a tool that can be used to support teachers, education stakeholders designing, implementing inclusive teaching through pedagogies, curriculum, and assessment. And there is 3 guiding principles. One is multiple means of representation, so addresses the what students are learning. The second one is the multiple means of action expression, which addresses the how students are learning. And the third one is about the multiple means of engagement, so targets the why of the learning. So it's actually very, very useful and has had very good effects on what the teachers can do in the classroom and how they can support students and also adapt the curriculum. Portugal also has these curriculum management measures, so there's different accommodations and adjustments. Just to go very briefly, so the one possibility is having a curriculum accommodation, and these are measures that support access to the curriculum and learning activities in classroom, which can be diversification, combination of various teaching methods, strategies, etc. Then another measure is non-significant curriculum adjustments, so they do not compromise the learning foreseen in the curriculum, so this can be different adaptation of objectives or content to develop competencies, particularly foreseen the profile of the students at the end of compulsory schooling, and I will get to that in the next slide. And then there are significant curriculum adjustments as another measure. And this actually has an impact on the learning foreseen curriculum document. So this can be alternative learning objectives, also establishing overall goals, etc. So there are a variety of measures on how you can manage the curriculum. So what is the student profile by the end of compulsory schooling? This was implemented a little bit before the inclusion law. It's a very interesting way of organizing your curriculum based on values, principles, and competence areas. So this spans through basically the whole curriculum and ensures that the values that are instilled in students, such as freedom, citizenship, excellence, and demand, go throughout the curriculum. There's also different competence areas, for instance, language and text, information, communication, critical thinking, etc. And they are part of bigger principles that they have for the education system in terms of learning, inclusion as a main principle, also the knowledge, sustainability, stability. So these, in a way, guide the whole curriculum that they have in place, and also what they want to instill in the students and in the schools. So moving on, the last 2 minutes on complex needs. This might be also perhaps some important lessons. So as I mentioned, there's actually almost all students attend mainstream schools. So the latest data, 2017, 2018, because after that, Portugal stopped collecting data based on student groups. In that year, about almost 99% of student special education needs were mainstream schools, most of them public schools, some in private schools, and the remaining 1.1% were enrolled in private special schools. There are only about 10 special schools now in Portugal. Most special schools were converted into resource centers for inclusion. I'll explain that in a second. And the special education teachers, as I mentioned, they are now considered specialist resources for schools, teachers, and students. So their whole kind of approach and profile has been changed, and they are now expected to support basically everyone. There is all the special education needs. They don't longer use this term, and they are now focusing on students in need of support measures. So just very briefly, they have 3 different support measures for students. There is the biggest group receives universal measures, and there are for all students. So this can be differentiated instruction, curriculum accommodation, enrichment, etc. And then there is a smaller group who receives selective measures, and they support students' more specific needs not addressed by these universal measures, and that can be differentiated curricular pathways, etc. And then the smallest group receives additional measures, and these are meant to respond to persistent need, for instance, in terms of communication, integration, cognition, learning, etc. And this could be significant curricular adaptations, individual transition plans, adapting teaching methodologies, etc. And this now guides their whole their whole approach in supporting students, and this is also how they collect the data now. It's based on the different support measures that are provided. The resource centers of inclusion, they provide now specialized support assistance to mainstream schools, and they intervene in a variety of areas. Could be specialized support units for students with multiple disabilities, could be also support for specialized evaluation of children, young people, special education needs, help with the support implementing curricular enrichment facilities, and also responsible for individual education programs. And then the last part, in last 10 seconds, is on the multidisciplinary teams and clusters. This is actually a very important aspect, and I think interesting also for Ireland, even though you don't have clusters, but the law basically requires now each school cluster to have a multidisciplinary team in place. It brings professionals from different, from within and beyond schools, and they work together and identify and meet the needs of students with physical impairments, other health-related issues. They are composed of permanent members and variable members. So won't go listen them. The variable members are chosen based on the student, and they meet regularly, not only to establish what the needs of the student might be, but also what support measures will be put in place, and also ensures that these are monitored and adapted and changed if necessary. And I already mentioned, and they also, if necessary, prepare individual education plans and individual transition plans, so it is easier for the students to have this individualized support, but it also the support for transition between the different education levels. So I will finish there. Sorry, I went a little bit over time, leave you with some of our resources. We've also, besides the work with Portugal, we work with also other countries, and last year we published a big synthesis report on equity inclusion in education, which focuses actually on all the 5 policy areas that I mentioned, and also includes some results from policy survey we did with countries and some key steps to equity inclusion. So thank you very much for your attention, and happy to have questions.